Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today, I'm covering Patrick SmartPants and SquidBob TentaclePants, which I've always thought were funny as sister episodes because their titles are so similar. And yet their plots are so different. I think they somewhat complement each other though, somewhat. I also think that these are two of the more well-known episodes of Season 4, so that's a treat. As always, thank you to everyone watching today, and now let me just get straight into it. Patrick SmartPants is going to be a fun episode to review because I think that this episode has a really nice plot. I won't say too much about this yet because I will of course get to talking about it later, but I just find this episode to be quite wholesome. And I've already discussed the interesting titular coincidence it shares with its sister episode, so I don't think I have any choice but to get right into reviewing this episode. This one starts off with SpongeBob and Patrick jellyfishing, which will always be a win in my book because I think jellyfishing is a cool activity that makes the atmosphere of Bikini Bottom more complete, which I'm pretty sure I've said before. And also, we haven't seen these two jellyfish in a while, so it's nice to do so here. Patrick SmartPants doesn't take too long to get into the swing of things, as Patrick goes running off of a cliff in a brilliant and funny show of stupidity. This is immediately followed by SpongeBob running after Patrick and finding that he is now smart. Smart Patrick has an infinitely expanding vocabulary and a new vocal cadence to match. I gotta say, Bill Fagerbakke did some excellent work voicing Patrick in this episode. He sounds so sophisticated and so different from normal Patrick while still being recognizable. I find it wholesome that Patrick at least initially tries to get SpongeBob to join in on his new version of fun. He still has that connection to SpongeBob, even as they've clearly become different people. Even later in the episode, he's both condescending and somewhat wholesome when he says he'll humor SpongeBob with his trivial pursuits. It's touches like these that make the episode an improvement over one like, oh, I don't know, Squidward School for Grown-Ups. I'll talk more about the wholesome and heartwarming content of this episode later, but I wanted to get this initial thought out there to show that the wholesomeness was there from the very beginning, not just the end. I also like that because Patrick changes so drastically in this episode, his dynamics with the other characters shift as well, making the episode intrinsically interesting. I'll get to SpongeBob in a minute, but first I want to talk about his interactions with Squidward. I like that Squidward and the new Patrick are able to initially forge a connection over music, but it's also funny because Patrick is really just throwing around the largest and most sophisticated sounding music terms possible, even though nobody who knows music actually talks like that. Sometimes taking artistic license makes things funnier to those who are in the know. I also love how Patrick roasts Squidward being like, that's because you rarely think. It reminds me of that comment that I made in my review of The Lost Mattress about how sometimes Patrick and Squidward's dynamic is not as friendly as it might seem, at least coming from Patrick's side. Sandy and Patrick's new dynamic is interesting to watch as well, considering that Sandy is one of the smartest people in the show. Squidward's segment was meant to demonstrate how Patrick has now become cultured, white people cultured anyway, and this segment is meant to show off his new smarts. Patrick's new condescending nature really jumps out in this part as he roasts Sandy for not being able to solve an equation. I say new condescending nature, though I'd argue that his character is frequently condescending, even when he's being an idiot. But anyway, I like how Sandy immediately picks up what Patrick's laying down and kicks his ass out because she doesn't take anyone's shit, least of all Patrick's. And now I can turn to the most important dynamic of this episode, which is SpongeBob and Patrick's. The change in their tried and true dynamic is the emotional crux of these 11 minutes. I'm honestly surprised that this episode is as emotional as it is, and the writers truly did not hold back by covering up this rather sad plot with jokes. I mean, just think about it. Earlier that day, SpongeBob and Patrick were having lots of fun, then Patrick suffers a catastrophic head injury that changes his entire personality and makes them both lose a friend. This episode is literally describing the aftermath of a TBI, or traumatic brain injury, for those of y'all who might not be familiar with the acronym. It's kind of some serious stuff being talked about here. Seeing Patrick show no interest in SpongeBob, while this could have been annoying in this episode, it's done very well, and so it just feels sad. Him calling SpongeBob Robert is pretty funny though, like he can't even lower himself to using such a childish nickname. But seriously, Patrick doesn't even show any ill will towards SpongeBob, and this makes the scene where he tells SpongeBob that they've grown apart much, much easier to watch, although it also makes it a lot sadder. And the scene where they're both looking at their friendship scrapbooks, which, first off, it's so adorable that they have complimentary scrapbooks, is very emotional and just simply well done. I really, really like that Patrick is not portrayed maliciously in this episode. I seriously cannot stress that enough. This episode is supposed to be about two best friends growing apart, which is something that happens a lot in real life, and it's natural. Yes, Smart Patrick is an asshole, but he isn't trying to be. I also love that Patrick realizes that he needs SpongeBob, which I find to be really freaking heartwarming, especially once we reach the conclusion of the episode. But before I get there, I just love how Patrick applies his newfound knowledge to trying to figure out why he and SpongeBob grew apart. The ensuing montage of him trying to do exactly that is fun to watch. Also, side note, but I literally just noticed that the screen grab I have up right now literally foreshadows the big reveal of the episode. Look at Patrick's x-ray. Look at the crack along his head. Wow, that's actually so amazing. Well, anyway, let me get back to the point I was about to make. So, overall, I love the friendship between SpongeBob and Patrick, or that the friendship between SpongeBob and Patrick is so strong that even as a completely different person, Patrick still desires, no, needs that friendship. And the episode isn't only full of feels by this point, the comedy is still very much there. Like, I love how Patrick just kidnapped SpongeBob because that was hilarious. The two hanging out in Jellyfish Fields again was fun. And then I love the part where SpongeBob's like, oh yeah, and Patrick's like, oh, absolutely. Patrick's determination to get their old friendship back just, it makes me really happy. I don't know what to say. Patrick's determination is so strong that he decides he's going to redo his actions for the day he stopped having fun with SpongeBob, meaning that he literally throws himself off the cliff again just so he can get his friendship back. That's true ride or die energy right there. And from there, the two discover that SpongeBob had accidentally plugged Patrick's head with some brain coral, which is why he ended up becoming so smart. And then I love how, with no hesitation, Patrick sacrifices his intellect so that he can still be friends with SpongeBob. It's endlessly sweet, and then I adored his declaration that knowledge can never replace friendship. The ending of this episode is then just so cute, with the best friends running off into the beautiful sunset. Another common W for the SpongeBob SquarePants background artists. Patrick SmartPants is a fantastic episode for fans of SpongeBob and Patrick's best friendship. It's really just so dang good It's so dang good about focusing on their friendship and how important it is for both of them and how strong it is. I love it for that. It's funny and engaging and heartwarming as well as heartbreaking. The only reason why I'm not going to be giving it a really high score is that in general, I do not find this episode to be the funniest, which does diminish my enjoyment of it a bit, but that wasn't really the episode's goal either. That was all in the plot. So of course, this episode can go nowhere but my amazing tier, where it comes in with a score of 9 out of 10. Coming up next is SquidBob TentaclePants. This episode walks the thin line between being completely forgotten and embedded in meme culture. And I say that because I'm sure that we can all remember the last little bit of this episode, but how many of us can say they remember the 10 minutes before that? Obviously, now I can remember those 10 minutes very clearly, but before I wrote the written review of this episode, I was hard-pressed to think past the barest plot of this one. SquidBob TentaclePants involves a lot more characters than you'd initially expect, or at least I think so. Squidward and SpongeBob are here, of course, but there's also Sandy, who plays an important role in the plot, and then brief appearances by Mr. Krabs, Mrs. Puff, Pearl, Patrick, and even Larry. Not to mention all the incidentals that are in this episode, too. I suppose that this is one of those episodes that makes it very clear that this is a show with an ensemble cast, which is something that I appreciate. Moving on to the actual plot now, I think that this episode's plot is very interesting and unique. It kind of feels like a plot from Phineas and Ferb, given that it's an invention that wreaks havoc. This isn't really a plot we normally get out of this show, and maybe that's because this show doesn't like using Sandy as much as it should. Heyo! I'll stop. Sandy's machine in this episode is pretty cool, and I love the visuals of SpongeBob and later Squidward using it. Honestly, this episode brings up a good point about teleportation, because what happens if someone teleports into something or someone? Do they fuse together? Does one or both things end up destroyed? I mean, if you think about it, if we could teleport, we'd be teleporting into a space where there are already particles of oxygen and nitrogen and all that fun stuff in the air. So could it ever work? Those two things would have to swap places. Leave it to me to overthink about the mechanics of teleportation when reviewing an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. I like the design of the fused Squidward and SpongeBob. I like that there isn't really all that much body horror involved here, which we know that these animators and designers are capable of, given what we'll be seeing later and what I've already put on your guys' screens. Really, this episode balances a fine line between horrific and comedic, which I love. Like for Squidward, this entire episode is a psychological horror fest, but for SpongeBob, it's a dream. And the tension there is comedic. And for the audience, we both feel that horror and the comedy throughout the episode. The montage of Squidward and SpongeBob trying to change back is full of so much creative character design, mixed feelings of horror and humor. It's very well done. From here, seeing SpongeBob and Squidward struggle to do their jobs while fused together isn't particularly funny or engaging, so that's a bit of a low point. But things pick back up again when we're treated to the beautiful sunset background here, and then the fused duo return to Sandy's place. Things get funnier again here. I love Sandal's reaction to Squidward and SpongeBob, and then it's even better when Sandy says that the machine won't be ready till tomorrow, and Squidward freaks the hell out. SpongeBob's face in this scene is hilarious. Seeing SpongeBob and Squidward struggle at that night honestly makes me feel sad for them, though, but in a good way. I love how the next day, Squidward goes out to give his performance anyway, despite being fused with SpongeBob, and I love that SpongeBob cheers him on. It was very wholesome. I also like that instead of watching everything go bad for Squidward for minutes on end, even though things do start out bad, we actually see him and SpongeBob win, as everyone thinks their fused form is pretty cool. I also like that this is what makes the ending stick out even more, because it comes completely out of left field. Squidward ends up bringing this bad ending on himself by messing with Sandy's machine after she managed to fix him and SpongeBob. The abrupt cut between the machine going off and Squidward in therapy just makes the whole thing. And man, what an ending it is with that horrific shot of the fused cast. Quite horrifying, honestly, but in the best way. I think that SquidBob TentaclePants is a pretty solid episode. It's not super funny, but the plot is interesting and the episode only really gets dull during that one moment at the Krusty Krab. This episode also has a feeling of waiting for something big to happen, which doesn't really happen until the final minute of the episode. Maybe it's kind of on purpose considering the anticlimactic outcome of Squidward's concert, but it's still true that I get this vibe and I end up being kind of disappointed in a way. All of this together is why I think this episode is a good fit for my good tier, where it comes in with a score of 7.3 out of 10. As always, I'm ending this review with some closing thoughts of mine. Well, the sister episodes with similar titles did not have similar scores. Probably not too much of a surprise, but sometimes I wonder if I'm unpredictable. Another thing that I was wondering about is how SquidBob TentaclePants does begin with the name of a certain popular ship. So now I wonder which came first, the name for the Squidward x SpongeBob ship or this episode. Not that I really care. I don't like SquidBob. Yes, it's true. I just don't see it at all. Honestly, I don't like a lot of SpongeBob ships, and I both mean ships involving the character and just ships within the show's universe, period. And that's not just because SpongeBob is my airways king, though that is a part of it. One last closing thought I had was that I honestly believe that SquidBob TentaclePants should be marketed as a Halloween episode. Maybe I need to add it to my Halloween marathon. I've added Squid's Visit. This one should go in there too. I think I'll do that for this year. And I think that's just about everything out of me. I suppose that means I'll end things here, and I'll see you all in the next review.